Alright, so first off we got the Kingpin fight. For the first boss fight of the game, I think this is pretty good. It introduces you to the main combat mechanic and it definitely gets you good at it, which you will need to be for the rest of the game. I think the boss fight really begins when you get in the room with Kingpin and all his men. That's where it starts to get difficult, and I remember the first time I played, I died here multiple times. That being said, the boss fight is pretty basic once you learn the mechanics, and on repeat playthroughs, it's really just a slog to get through. I do still think the boss fight is quite fun, so I guess I'll give it a B tier. Next we got the Shocker boss fight. I love this one. It's so varied compared to most boss fights in the game. It actually has multiple stages and requires you to use your brain, which is not at all common for modern boss fights. Most boss fights in this game will require you to identify a pattern and then just exploit it. And while that still is the case here, they do a lot to make it as interesting as possible. This gets a well-deserved A. So I didn't really know where to put this next boss fight because it doesn't fit into the story, but I guess I'll just put it in here. The Tombstone fight. Man, Tombstone is awesome in this game. I mean, it's basically just a Kingpin fight, but harder, which I'm all for. It's got two real stages, one where you're just beating up men, and another where you're beating up Tombstone, with a flaming chain. That's pretty awesome. I'd say if you weren't a fan of the Kingpin fight because of its simplicity, then this one won't be for you either. But personally, the simplicity doesn't bother me. And you gotta respect, this was a diamond in the rough for the side missions in this game. It's just barely below A tier for me. Next, the Mr. Negative train boss fight, or I'm almost hesitant to call this a boss fight. It's more like an interactive geometry dash game. It's not good. Don't get me wrong, it definitely looks very cool if this were like a movie or something. But in terms of gameplay, this provides pretty much nothing. It's just repeating a pattern over and over and over until you win. I remember being so hyped for this boss fight the first time round, and then when I actually got to it and beat it, just being utterly disappointed. I'm really glad this wasn't the one and only fight we have with him though. So this is a tough ranking. On one hand, it does look really cool, but in terms of gameplay, it provides the bare minimum, if even that. So I just have to give it a D tier. Next, the Vulture and Electro fight. It's pretty good. Having to deal with both of them at the same time is quite fun, and it does require a bit of mechanical skill from the player, which is always appreciated. I only wish Vulture's part was a little more challenging. All he does is throw blades and charge at you, which is ridiculously obvious not to get hit by. But it is fun, and it has a bit of a difficulty curve. That's all I really expect out of a boss fight, for it to be fun and just a bit challenging. If it can provide both of those, then I most likely will enjoy it. It goes at the top of B. Next, the Rhino Scorpion boss fight. This is definitely the superior out of the double boss fights. Getting Rhino to go underneath the things you need to hit him with is not exactly easy, and then when you add Scorpion into the mix, it becomes much more difficult. It's kind of ironic how the game tries to show you that they have really bad teamwork, when in reality, Electro and Vulture have worse teamwork. While in that boss fight you're more or less fighting them separately on their own, in this boss fight they have kind of a bit of synergy, because Scorpion will spray you with his tail as you're trying to get Rhino into position. It's just this interesting dynamic that the Electro and Vulture fight doesn't have that makes this one so interesting. This one is definitely an S tier. Alright, the Mr. Negative second boss fight. It's definitely better than the first. You know, to start it's pretty easy, Mr. Negative just throwing things at you, but it's once you get to the second stage, that's when things get interesting. He spawns this huge hulking demon monster, and I gotta say, this is the coolest looking level out of any Spider-Man boss fight I've seen. Unfortunately, I don't think the gameplay lives up to the amazing visuals. You may also notice a pattern with a lot of the boss fights in this game, where it's just beat up the small guys and then move on to the big one. It's the case for the Kingpin, Tombstone, and second Mr. Negative fight. And by this stage, I'm just kind of bored with it. I've been beating up guys this whole game. I want to fight the big monster. It should have been something along the lines of the Ra's al Ghul fight in Arkham City. Instead, we're just doing the thing we've already been doing for the entirety of the game. So yeah, the second Mr. Negative fight is also a disappointment, but to give it its due, it does look cool like the first one, and there is a bit of substance to the gameplay, but it's just painfully generic. C tier. And now we reach the final boss fight. So okay, I do love this boss fight in a sense. The vibes, basically everything cinematically about this I love. But if we're talking about the gameplay, well, it's okay. It's not the worst thing I've ever seen, but it's definitely not the best. It's very simplistic. You're pretty much just web swinging around and then webbing him so you can then attack him. Every now and again he'll go on top of like the tower and you just gotta web strike him really. And then the second stage is basically just the Martin Lee train fight, but worse. Also, I find it kind of distracting how Doc Ock has a static face here when you're doing this animation, and you will see this animation many times in this boss fight. On a basic level, this boss fight is fun. I just wish it required a little more from the player. And I can kind of excuse its shortcomings, because this boss fight really was more for the story than it was for the gameplay. So taking that into account, I think a C tier is justified. It's better than the Mr. Negative fight. I'm pretty sure Spider-Man 2 will improve on the boss fights. But yeah, that's all for this video. Thanks for watching.